Chapter 1 in our textbook is basically going to be an introduction to the research process. An overview of what we're going to look at in Chapter 1, or what you'll be studying and reading in Chapter 1, is the process that takes place when an individual wants to conduct a study. There are different steps that are obtained throughout our research process that allows us to have a research project that is both reliable as well as valid. And also, we want to look at our research and what we read as something that is significant, scientifically significant. We want to make sure that the results that we're reading are relevant, that something isn't just put together and the authors come up with a determination as to what they were studying, but are those results really reliable results? How did they measure the study that they were doing? So within this chapter, we look at levels of measurement. We look at the different designs that can be used in a research process when we set up the whole research itself, the project. And we also want to look at some things that we talk about that are variables that can actually cause what causes what to happen in our study. So if we're looking at, as a dental hygienist, I always look at tooth decay, and if we're looking at what causes acid erosion on an individual's teeth, we can look at all different factors. We can look at sugar, we can look at poor oral hygiene, we can look at lack of instruction, we can look at soda pops and the acid that is contained in soda pops. So what are we actually going to study causes the tooth decay, just for an example? So we're going to kind of look at a few things throughout Chapter 1. The research process, just looking at the slide right now, the research process itself is we're going to look at coming up with a hypothesis. What do we want to study? And when I used to teach dental public health, when I taught in the dental hygiene program at Youngstown State, I taught biostatistics and dental public health. And the one question I would always throw out to the students is, what's a hypothesis? And I don't think anybody in the class did not know what a hypothesis was. Everybody knows it's an educated guess. So basically, when there's something that you want to research, or there's something that you're interested in or you want to study, you can look at coming up, once again, if I use that description or that example of what causes erosion, acid erosion of teeth. Well, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go out there and I'm going to look at all the literature that's available on acid erosion and an individual's teeth. From the research, and it has to be relevant and it has to be scientifically significant, I'm going to read that, and from that relevant literature, I'm going to look at what is out there that's saying acid erosion is caused from poor oral hygiene. What's out there that says it's caused by soda pop and acid? What by levels of education? I'm going to look at everything. I'm going to gather everything together. Then I'm going to come up with my idea. So when I was a practicing dental hygienist, you know, I would see these kids that would come in and they would be teenagers and they would have decay all along the gum line, which decay cavities all along the gum line. And this was long before we even had the realization that the acid in pop, not just the sugar, was causing the erosion on teeth. So ideally, I could have come up with an idea saying, by talking to that patient, going over their diet, their hygiene habits, their fluoride intake, a lot of variables, I could ask this patient, and maybe the one thing they're saying is, well, I drink a lot of diet pop. Well, the first thing that would come to my mind would be, oh, diet pop, no sugar involved. That's not what's causing it. But if I was inquisitive, I could say, why does he have good hygiene? Why does he have fluoride in his diet? But why do we still have this erosion on the teeth? So that might make me generate the idea that maybe it's the acid and not the sugar that's causing this erosion, which we do know years later came to play that the studies were completed, and we did find out that it was the acid in pop, not just the sugar, that causes the erosion. So generating a research idea is important. And then from there, you're going to come up with your research hypothesis, which you're basically going to say, I believe, or I take that back, we never say I believe, but say, I think through my research and also through my research design in the methods that were used, I'm going to say that soda pop, the acid in soda pop causes acid erosion. And that's going to be my hypothesis. Basically what I think when I do my study, what I'm going to come up with. Now, if I do my study and the study does not indicate that, then of course the hypothesis isn't going to be accepted, because your hypothesis, your idea was not actually shown to be true within your study. So after that hypothesis, then we're going to come up with our design study. Well, how are we going to do this study? How are we going to conduct the study? Once we conduct the study, then we can analyze the data that we have gathered from the study. And then based on that data, we can make a decision about the hypothesis. Did our data support our hypothesis, or did it not support our hypothesis? For this class, we are not going to be using SPSS, which is a analytical program on the computer that you plug data into and it gives us our results. We're not going to be doing that because the course itself is just really going to be a class about basic statistics and having a good understanding of statistics. So just to reiterate a little bit the importance of reading previous research, basically you can see how others have tackled similar issues. You can see what they have looked at in the past. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if it's already been done, the study's been done, and it's a pretty relevant study, you can use that data. You can incorporate that into your literature review that you're going to write to support your research project. Researchers identify avenues for future research. Basically, we're saying that the individual comes up with results, but maybe from those results there's something else that's been exposed that's relevant. And maybe that's going to be something that we're going to look at a little bit further in another study, but it's not going to be shared, or it's really not going to be published in this study. But there are results that have come from it that are kind of unexpected. And also looking at previous research and doing a good literature review saves you from doing unnecessary research. Like I said already, if you have already if the research is already out there, then why are we going to be doing it again? So when I talk about redoing research, when I was preparing to start my dissertation, I had worked in the prison system doing dental hygiene for many years, and from that experience in the prison, I really, talking to the inmates, I really came up with this idea on my own, so I thought, that a lot of these kids were kicked out of school because of poor behavior. And so, I started looking into it and I started doing some research on zero tolerance, and I came up with this idea for my dissertation, which was completely shot down, but I wanted to show a relationship between zero tolerance and future incarceration. Well, uh, you know, lo and behold, my dissertation committee advisor, said, it's been done over and over and over and over again. And yeah, there definitely is an association. So why are we going to do this again? So that was my ignorance. I should have been looking at some statistical significant studies that were out there in order to have saved myself a lot of time. So, a couple different levels of measurement that we look at when we are gathering data. There are actually 4 levels, and a nominal level is basically the lowest level of data that you can acquire. It's called categorical. It's not continuous. I'll go back and identify the 4 types of levels of measurement. Nominal and ordinal are something that are called categorical areas of data. So meaning that basically what you're going to be looking at is putting your data in categories. The other 2 areas, which are interval and ratio, those are called continuous data categories. And basically what we're going to look at with continuous is that you can start to measure. You can actually get measurements. You can tell a difference between one item and another based on the number. So going back to nominal right now, saying that something is unordered categories, or there is no order to it, basically. And what we're going to say with that is, if we're looking at something, say boy girl, you can't really, there's no ranking a boy or a girl, male, female. It's just a different variable. One would be a male, one would be a female. There's no way to actually rank if one is more significant than the other. So we always say that that's probably a pretty good example of a nominal scale category, just being male and females. The next order is ordinal, and ordinal, basically we have some categories. There's a difference between scores and they're just not equal. However, they're still not something that we can rank. We can start getting a little bit of information on an ordinal level, but there's different categories that we must use with ordinal levels of measurement. So the book talks a little bit about, if on page 9 we talk a little bit about an absolute, not very good, neither good or bad, quite good, and absolutely fabulous. Now if we assign a number to each one of those responses, then we can rank. We can start to rank that if everybody answers, say, number 2, as seen in the book, then we know that that means not very good, and we can rank number 2 as a little bit worse than number 3, but a little bit better than number 1. So we can start to rank then. So we have some up and down. We can kind of identify something being a little bit different or not equal. The next area is interval, And the problem with interval, once again, this is, like I said, it is categorical. I'm sorry, continuous. And when we look at interval, we can determine basically a rank. So if we had a scale, we could actually say there's an absolute 0 on that scale. And say before that scale, there's a difference. There's 1 point higher and 1 point lower. So there's an actual point of 0 when we start ranking things on an interval level. Now, the problem with an interval levels of measurement is that if we say we want to say temperature, which the book uses as an example, we know that there is a 0 temperature, but does it really mean 0? Because if we're going to measure temperature, an individual is probably never a 0 temperature. So even though we can measure temperature, which would be interval, there really isn't ever actually a 0 when we measure temperature. Same thing with weight. If we're going to measure somebody's weight, we know that that individual, a person, is never ever born and doesn't have a weight. So discussing or talking about 0 as the absolute lowest point, it's still very hard to measure, because even though there is a 0, we can measure weight and we can measure someone's body temperature as being higher or lower, but there's never going to be an actual 0 to measure from. Now, where we have a fixed 0 is what we call a ratio, and that means that we actually we go from a 0 to whatever we're measuring. We have a fixed number 0. So it's an interesting concept, but you'll understand it a little bit better once we get a little bit more into the statistics and levels of measurements and the different designs that are out there, and you'll have a better understanding. Just understand that nominal and ordinal levels, those are called categorical, and that interval and ratio are called continuous levels of measurement. So when it comes to actually learning a little bit about our what we're going to study and what kind of data we're going to gather, we need to know what level of measurement we're using in order to know what test we can use to study or to look at our experiment in the data. So when we look at designs and we look at research designs, we are going to look at different methods that can be utilized or that can be used to actually measure what we're setting out to measure, what we're measuring in our hypothesis. Now, within this class, we're not going to get very deep into research designs, because you are going to have another class within the Allied Health program that's called Research Methods, and they're going to talk a lot about different designs. But what we're going to look at are just basically some differences between different conditions that would cause whatever the causation we talked about before. What conditions are varied that would cause such a particular event to happen, such as, go back to the dental erosion again, what is causing that erosion on that individual's teeth? Is it the fact that they have poor oral hygiene? Is it the fact that their education has not been as comparable as somebody else's education? Is it the fact that they don't have fluoride in their water, or maybe that they didn't have fluoride when their teeth were forming and developing? We can look at quite a few different conditions that possibly could cause variations within our study. We're also going to look at different relationships that we could actually find from the variables that we're going to be looking at. Now, talking a little bit about a variable, it's kind of always confusing, and I can remember when I first started the doctorate program that we learned a lot about independent and dependent variables. And the one variable that we talk about as independent is basically one that the researcher is going to manipulate. That is the variable that the researcher is going to see by manipulating that particular variable. Is there an effect on another variable? And the other variable would be called dependent. So if we're going to actually say that we're looking at the tooth decay that would come from soda pop, called acid erosion, if we're going to say that the tooth decay is what we're really going to be looking at, and we can kind of manipulate that concept a little bit, that's going to be our dependent variable. That's really what we're looking at, is the tooth decay on that individual. Now, the independent variables, once again, we can go back and say independent variable in acid erosion. Is it poor oral hygiene? Is it the fluoride intake? Is it, the fluoride that they had as a child during tooth formation? So see, there's several variables, but we're always going to think of the independent variable as the one that really kind of sits by itself. That's really what we're going to look at, is that independent variable. And then we're going to look at all these other dependent variables that have something to do probably with the acid erosion, but we're really going to look at that soda pop as our primary variable within the designs of, if I was doing this research project, within the design, saying this is what causes acid erosion, is the soda pop. So a few different areas that we can look at when we're doing our research study, or when a research study is being done, is there's different conditions that can be acquired, or the participants can be held to as far as the design goes. And one of the conditions that we can talk about is something called between groups designs. And basically what we're going to be doing with that is we're going to be looking at two different groups of people. Maybe they have a lot of things in common, say maybe age. If I'm going to be looking at acid erosion, I might want to look at all males and break them into two separate groups, and maybe have all males between 16 and 18 years old, have two separate groups, and then have my my experiment to be based on a variable, once again, that is thrown into these groups. So we know that we have two groups of males between the ages of 16 to 18, and now we're going to look at these dependent variables that, and go back on my study group again and say that actually we're going to be looking at two groups of males between the ages of 16 and 18 that have acid erosion, and that dependent variable, the independent variable being the acid erosion, and what is the dependent variable. So now we're going to be looking, we can kind of manipulate that a little bit. We can say one group, you're not going to brush your teeth, but only once a day. The other group, and you cannot have any pop or soda, but the other group, you're going to brush your teeth 3 times a day, and you're going to drink soda pop 3 times a day. So you see that's an experimental design, but we can manipulate things. We can manipulate that independent variable a little bit by causation and what we're actually doing to these experimental groups. The other group that we can talk about is within group designs, and basically that is all participants take part in every condition of the study. So it's the same group of people, and we're going to study that same group of people, and everything we do to both groups, everything that's done to one group is going to be done to the other group. So the book actually talks a little bit about the individuals in between group, within group designs, and basically they talk a little bit about um, seeing whether or not the different participants, if the condition that you're studying in comparing is changing within that group based on manipulation or based on not manipulating. So a problem that you can see within group designs are a lot of times there are so many variables that could play a part in what we're looking at that it's hard to tell whether or not one issue is causing another issue. So looking at the differences between conditions could be the result of the effects that you're seeing, such as the book talks about fatigue for the individual within the group, um, boredom of the project that they've allowed themselves to be involved in. Did they learn something along the way? Uh, did did the individual that we're studying, looking at the acid erosion, did they happen to go to their dentist and their dentist told them, don't drink so much pop because you're going to be at a risk for tooth decay? So maybe they quit drinking pop because of that. So different changes can happen within the group designs that can alter the outcome. So even an example I used to use was when an individual, say you're doing a tobacco cessation project and you want to measure whether or not your health education program that you implemented on tobacco cessation, you're going to measure these individuals on whether or not it's successful or not. Well, there are things that could go on during the time you're doing that study that could alter the results. One being, did the individual go to another tobacco cessation program where they work that altered their thought process? You would have no way of knowing that unless that would be something that you would add to your research process. So see, these are variables that can come into play when you don't expect them to come into play, that can alter the reliability of that actual study. Within group designs, it's a really nice method. It's a nice way to actually design a research project, because basically within group designs, all you're going to be looking at is going to be one group of people. So with one group of people, we can allow for changes, and we can allow for variables, because we're not going to be looking at, number one, so many people, and number two, we can keep better rein on those individuals that we're studying. So the book talks a little bit about doing a study, an experimental study on migraine sufferers, and they talk about 40 migraine sufferers. You can, once the person has an individual, you could split them into two groups, and once the individual in the first group has a migraine, you can give them ibuprofen, and in the second group, when they have a migraine, give them ibuprofen. But if you want to say you're studying something that's a new method or a new medication or a new treatment, you can take those two groups of people again, and the first group you can give them the ibuprofen when they get the migraine, and then give them your new medication or your experimental treatment, and see if those individuals have more relief than the second group that just had the ibuprofen. And now remember, with these two groups, within group designs, within these two groups, we can start to measure how much relief the individual is getting. So we could come up with a design saying, I'm sure all of you have heard of the scale of a scale from 1 to 10. Can you tell me how much pain you're in? So you can use a scale like that, and now we can start to rank whether or not the individuals have more relief. Say maybe they have relief of, on a scale of 1 to 10, their pain level is a 5, but when they get the extra medication, their pain level may be a 2. So then we're able to rank that there's a definite improvement in the pain level. So if you look at the slide, you can see half the participants get the new treatment. We can measure the pain relief, give them ibuprofen, measure the pain relief again. Then the next other half of the participants, give them ibuprofen, measure pain relief. Then maybe we're going to give them their new treatment and measure pain relief. So where are they getting the most pain relief? We're able to have two separate groups doing the exact same thing, but we're manipulating those variables again by manipulating what order we're giving the participants their medication or their treatment. And just going back to talking about experimental studies, in Module 1, I want you to look, I have a video posted on ethical treatment of human beings. And remember, with a lot of our experimental studies, we have to look at the ethical treatment of the human being, of the individual. So experimental studies, they generally, you have to go through something called an internal review board. And basically we're going to be looking at, with that internal review board, we're going to look at what risk this experiment or this research project that you're doing can cause to that individual. So another type of design to talk about is correlational or co-relational designs. And when in basically that type of design is exactly what it sounds like. It's one variable directly related to another variable. A lot of times it's used basically just to show relationships between variables. They show how one variable changes in relation to another variable. Like I said before, we're not going to get into a lot of research plotted within statistical programs, but understand that we can look at variables and their relationship in something called a scattergram, which we'll talk about more when we do talk about how to present our the relationships, or how to present our data. If it's a positive relationship, if there's a positive relationship between two things, one variable increases as the other one increases. So if we talk about, I believe the book discusses weight and individuals' level of income. And within the study, they talked about individuals, the more money they make, the heavier they are. And so you can look at that, you could do a study. Initially, it probably came up with, is there a relationship between level of income and weight? You can also look at, is there a relationship between cigarette smoking and a decrease in an individual's longevity. Okay, you can look at these two things and you can measure the relationship between them. And when we talk about a negative relationship, basically what you're going to be looking at is one variable decreases as the other variable increases. So looking at weight and level of income as one, if it's a positive relationship, we would say both of them are variables, and one variable increases as the other variable increases. So weight increases, well, income increases. If it's a negative relationship, it's going to go down. So we're going to say that it's going to be the level of income is going to maybe go up, but the individual's weight is going to decrease, or vice versa. So you can see there's a negative and a positive relationship when it comes to correlational designs. So when we look at the scattergram showing positive relationship, we kind of want to we look at the percentage of overweight individuals in a society, and that's on the left hand side, and I'm going to mark that with a 1 and a little circle around it. And then we're going to compare that to the average annual income of individuals, and I'm going to mark that with a 2, and then I'll circle that for us. And so looking at the comparison, you can say that in this particular scattergram that we have average individuals that make about $50,000 a year, $40,000 to $45,000 a year, actually. Probably between 20 and 30% are overweight in society. And so we'll mark that as a 3. And then if we want to go and we want to look at the 30,000 percentile, we're going to look at them having a lower overall obesity within society, being at about 20%. We'll mark that, mark that with a 4. And then if we really want to look at the outliers here, we're going to look at between $50,000 and $60,000. And we look at these people with the $60,000, $55,000. Several of them are in the 50 percentile of obesity. And we'll mark that with a number 5. And then if we want to look at individuals at about $50,000, let's say $45,000, $50,000, and the majority of them are in the 25 to 30,000 percentile, right here. So we kind of look at that and we say, okay, so we'll mark that with a 6. But if we look at that, we could say, okay, that's pretty much a positive relationship. I mean, I can look at this and say, okay, there's a positive relationship between individuals making about $50,000 a year, and they're at 40% overweight in our society. And the more I look at this scattergram, I can look at it and say, okay, the more that individual's income increases, the higher that individual's obesity or being overweight in society increases. So this in itself, we can say, is a positive relationship because, once again, looking at the scale, the higher the average income is, looking at this scale, the higher the individual's obesity is. So if I want to look at a scattergram and I want to identify the negative relationship, I can look at, on this particular scattergram, the life expectancy of an individual in years associated with the number of cigarettes smoked in one day. So what makes this a negative relationship is if I look at the number of cigarettes and I go clear to the end and I see 50 cigarettes, which I will identify over here with the 1, 50 cigarettes, and the more cigarettes that individual smokes, the less their life expectancy is. However, if I go all the way over here to 10, I'll mark that with a 2, I can identify the negative relationship of number of cigarettes being 10 smoked daily, and we can say that the average life expectancy here is 75. If I want to go in between and say a pack of cigarettes, which is 20 cigarettes a day, I can kind of identify anywhere between an average of 60 to 70 years in age. And then the more this individual smokes, or the group smokes, over here being 30 cigarettes, which I'll mark with a 3, 30 cigarettes a day, you can see the average lifespan of that individual is going to be probably around 55 or 60, which is right here. And I'll mark that with a 4. So, talking about a negative relationship when we do a study is going to identify the number of cigarettes smoked per day. The more that individual smokes, the less years of life expectancy that individual is going to have. The less cigarettes they smoke, the more years of life expectancy they're going to have. So that's the negative relationship that we're talking about. So just kind of talking a little bit at the very end of this chapter on, kind of identifying and looking at the causation or what causes one one variable to interact with another variable or an independent variable, and how the dependent variables are related. Just to look at the different designs that we have kind of looked at, the experimental design is probably going to be the most reliable as far as determining relationships on what causes what, just because we're actually experimenting. We are actually putting the variables or the dependent variables in with the independent variables and expecting and measuring the result. The quasi-experimental designs, they have an increase as far as potential for identifying variables, but they aren't nearly as reliable as actually doing the experiment and measuring our results from the experiment. And then we had talked about co-relational or correlational designs. And they're really the weakest as far as establishing causal relationships, just because we aren't really experimenting. We're just kind of, they don't like to use the word estimating, but that's basically what we're doing. We're kind of estimating, we're kind of identifying what we think might be the cause, but we're really not measuring that. So when it comes to causation, if you're really going to do a research project, you're going to want to look at experimental designs primarily. That's going to be your best design. Now, there are circumstances that are going to interfere with that or not going to allow us to proceed in the area that we want to. However, whatever we can recover, as long as the reliability and validity um, of our experiment or of our research is accurate, then we're still going to be providing information for our discipline and for future research. So just to summarize, in this chapter, in chapter 1, we talked a little bit about the research process, what goes into it, what's involved with it. We talked about our levels of measurement, which we talked about categorical as well as continuous levels of measurement. And of course, the more in depth we go as far as uh, continuous measurement is going to be a little bit more accurate. We talked about a few designs, and as far as within group designs, correlational designs, between group designs, experimental randomized controls. We talked a little bit about the ethics involved, and once again I want to remind everyone to watch the video in Module 1 about the ethics and why ethics in when using human subjects is so important. And we talked at the very end about causation, what causes what, and why this is so important when we talk about independent variables and our dependent variables. And even though we think that independent seems like it would be actually the dependent, we want to think in our minds as the independent is going to sit by itself, and that's kind of what we're looking at, and something is dependent on it. So we're going to look at all the things that are going to be dependent on altering that independent variable as far as causation.